For those who have careers that keep them out at sea for long periods of time, what is the creepiest thing you've seen out in the water? One time on an airport trip, my Uber driver was saying that he used to do security on tankers, that they would run across empty vessels more than you could possibly imagine, just floating, contents undisturbed, wallets, photos, everything. They would hail them with no response, and not knowing if it was a trap to get close enough to take over the ship. Pirates and ransoming the ship is apparently also more common than you'd think. Not the people, though, just the cargo. Anyway, the security team would have to board the ghost ship and scope out the situation. Even yachts. When there was no one aboard, they would sink them to avoid floating strike risks. I was like, surely there's some kind of finder's fee. And he was like, who are you going to call? Made me really wish a John Krakauer or Sebastian Junger would sink his teeth into that story. It'd be a hell of a book. Edit. It seemed like there was no central body to call to salvage it. You're in international waters, so there's no Coast Guard. He implied that everyone who lost track of a ship like that likely lacked the resources/desire to retrieve it. I imagine the ship recorded in their log when they came across other vessels, but whether that information goes up to some authority, I don't know. Being myself in supply chain management, I know that oceanic shipping can be seriously sketchy. So although I can't corroborate the story, and part of why I posted was to see if it scared up any similar stories, it was related to me as fact and didn't strike me as a tall tale. Story 2. I worked on the sailboat one summer in the Bahamas, and something that you see a lot when you're in the ocean is kayaks and life jackets floating around, and you always radio them in, but they always just fell off a yacht or something, and it's never a big deal. Once we found a kayak floating, and it had a fishing rod in the rod holder, which basically meant someone was using it. Edit. Didn't see how viral this went overnight. Some people were asking questions. The Coast Guard doesn't really even look into this stuff unless there's a confounding report, so we never received an update. Not that I would have expected one unless there was a full-scale search. We went up close to it, and it had the removable seat cushions still in, which further convinced us that someone had been using it. There was nothing else to see. The line was in the water, but we never really revisited it. We tried not to talk about it because the kids on the boat got creeped out after the adults kind of freaked out and didn't control their emotions. Story 3. Contract Mariner. I disappear into the blue sea for 6 to 8 months a year. Creepy? Not much, honestly. The sound of moaning steel due to slack tanks when you're rolling really hard can be a bit unnerving. St. Elmo's fire is pretty neat. Fata Morgana, aka the Flying Dutchman, is pretty cool to see in real life. After a while, the only thing out there that really spooks you is a problem you have that directly influences your survival. All the spooky crap I've ever been a part of have been no bullcrap emergencies. Fire in the engine control room, I'm the first responder down there to see if it's an actual emergency or a effed up concilium sensor. Wall of toxic smoke from burning electronics in the high voltage room? Oh, F. Have an emergency weather sortie because we're dragging anchor and rolling 30 degrees with 50 feet UKC and we're getting pushed toward the island? F me. 10 shots ain't enough. We're about to run aground in a 55,000-ton, 800-foot ship. Pucker factor. Oops. Now we get to hook up and get the F out of there and we immediately lose steering and propulsion. Good crap. I've seen brand new million-dollar sport fishers capsized and bobbing around like a cork 1,000 miles from land. I've seen tiny little songbirds skipping along the surface, just barely clinging to life, but they're also flying as hard as they can to find land. Some of the saddest crap I've ever seen are those little birds skipping off the water as they fly further out to sea, hoping to all F they've come across some land. I don't know. I'm on the Yingling at a port bar and I'm rambling. To answer your question, TLDR style, the creepiest thing about being out there are the bottomless depths of sadness, loneliness, and heartache. You'll go to places in your mind that words will never be able to do any justice in trying to describe. So that is something that I have never in all my life considered is birds flying the wrong way out to sea that get tired, have to land, and there's no land to land on, and so they just plummet into the water and drown. That's kind of crazy. Literally never thought of that before. Story 4. Creepiest thing I've seen has definitely been seeing myself and other crewmates lose our minds. On one particularly awful voyage, everything that could go wrong went wrong, and we found ourselves without food, water, and sleep for a very unhealthy amount of time. It started off with auditory hallucinations. Ships are noisy, and when you're going crazy, you begin to think those noises are talking to you. I heard children laughing, a choir singing, and creepiest of all, a particular splash that sounded like it was calling my name from the sea. Combine that with visual hallucinations, and then things get really terrifying. I was convinced we were in the desert at one point, with sand all around us and mountains in the distance. Another crew member freaked out and told us we were about to run into an apartment building. The creepiest thing I saw was an all-black flying pig with red eyes on the bow. I think the scariest, though, was when someone was convinced we lost part of our crew overboard. It turned into a massive, delirious argument over where everyone was, even though we were all accounted for. That trip was brutal, and the captain put us all in a terrible situation due to sheer incompetence. Other than that, there was this one time I saw 3 gigantic ships in the distance with no lights, and they did not show up on AIS. Suddenly, they were gone. It was extremely creepy. Story 5. Right, a long-time lurker, first-time poster here. I'm no longer at sea, but used to, as a younger chap with romantic ideas, spend months on end on cargo ships. Mostly tankers, crude oil VLCC, and refined product tankers, but with a little time in oil and gas and towing, I came ashore in 2017 with a Master Unlimited ticket, sailing as a chief officer. My last ship was a self-discharging bulk carrier. Anyway, I digress. It wasn't so much about what I saw, which was creepy. I saw plenty of interesting things I wouldn't have seen anywhere else. However, I was second mate on a tanker distributing refined oil products around the coast of New Zealand. A yacht had sailed from a port on the east coast, bound for another port just down the coast a bit, but it had disappeared. Solo sailor on board, aside from his dog. Nonetheless, the search proved fruitless and it was suspended. However, for weeks afterwards, it was about 01:30 in the morning, and Rescue Coordination Center would broadcast a plea at the end of the weather and navigation warning broadcast, asking for the yacht to make contact if it could hear the message and was able to do so. I'd sit in the dark, chain smoking, and working on my 7th cup of coffee, looking out into the black, imagining the guy who'd had a stroke or heart attack on board, with the same broadcast playing out on his radio while his dog ate his face to keep from starving. Or imagining him having fallen over the side, imagining what it'd be like watching your yacht sailing indifferently off into the distance, with your dog in the cockpit pacing and agitated, unable to do anything about it. Knowing you were effed and had a matter of hours, if that left to live before the cold got to you or exhaustion. Or imagining the dog starving and dying on a yacht by itself weeks later, listening to the same broadcast in the dark. The places your mind goes in the dark by yourself. They found the yacht in the end. The dog was still alive. Well, let's just take a moment to appreciate the fact that the dog survived. Sucks for the mate, but there's always a better story when the animal in the situation makes it through. Story 6. I was in the U.S. Navy for about 10 years and have tens of thousands of miles at sea in an aircraft carrier. Countless nights on the flight deck in the middle of the night in middle of the ocean. Creepiest, a huge patch of the ocean glowing, like nuclear waste in The Simpsons glowing. I've seen bioluminescent algae of a few kinds, and this was nothing like it. I've never seen anything like it before or since. Weirdest thing, hundreds of miles out to sea from land, and there was a massive fire on the water. It was like the top of a gas refinery, but on the water with nothing under it but water. Flame going a few stories into the air. Saddest, a fellow sailor trying to jump overboard. He apparently got a Dear John email and pictures from his cheating wife and decided to end it. We were on the smoke deck. He bummed a cigarette, then asked the time. We said 2300. He replied, "Sounds like a good time to die," and in one motion tried to launch over the chest-high wall, with an opening to the water below. Luckily, we were faster than him. We grabbed his legs and wrestled him down and laid on him and basically hogtied him till the MAs, Navy cops, got there. Broke my heart because he was a good dude. I never saw him again. He got transferred off the ship shortly after. Not sure what happened to him, but I hope he's doing better. Funniest, 2 flying fish collide mid-air. I was smoking when we were in the Persian Gulf and saw the fish fly from a pretty far distance towards each other. I remember thinking, there's no effing way they're gonna hit. Then, split splash! I was in tears laughing, but no one saw it. Everyone just thought I was a weirdo, but I got to see a miracle of nature, lol. Story 7. Not so much what I saw, but what I experienced. I was once underway in the Gulf of Alaska during a November gale. Waves were up to 35 feet, with some rollers hitting 45. An uncommon occurrence in the diesel-electric ship I was on was a cycloconverter tripping. When this happened, the ship would temporarily completely lose power and propulsion until some electricians could reset everything. This happened during that gale. I can't explain how strange it is for the boat you're on to all of a sudden go so quiet that you can clearly hear waves slapping the ship and metal bending and flexing, knowing you're completely at the mercy of the sea. knowing that if the ship lost its bearing and went beam to where was a real possibility of capsizing. It's easy to forget when you're at sea that the only thing keeping you alive is a bunch of steel welded together. At that moment, I was fully aware, and it humbled me. Thankfully, we trained frequently for this and had everything fired back up relatively quickly. Another time I recall was when the ship took a rogue wave. They're absolutely real, and I believe they account for a massive number of shipwrecks. It was late at night and I was on the bridge. We were passing through a storm and were taking the waves off the bow with no visibility. As the ship moves, there's normally a pretty standard pattern. You ride up a wave for a bit and then you fall down the wave for a bit. Well, we started riding up a wave and got to the point where we should have been starting our ride down, but we just kept climbing, and then it happened. We started our ride down the back of this massive wave. All of us braced ourselves and tried to find something to hold on to, but we all fell to the deck anyway. Anything that wasn't secured for sea fell down all around us. Manuals, tables, computers, printers, you name it. Our captain, who was sleeping, called up to the bridge asking if we hit something. It woke the entire crew up. Rogue waves are real, and they're terrifying. I can't imagine being in a smaller boat and taking one of them broadside. Story 8. I was in a glass-bottom boat in the 1970s off the coast of Oahu. We were going out to see a pod of whales. The boat captain was a grizzled old Hawaiian, sun-baked to the color of mahogany. It was an older boat, retrofit with a glass bottom and bench seating. He was narrating over a PA as we left the dock. We motored out for about 30 minutes, and the view out of the bottom of the boat was disappointing. Just long streams of bubbles obscuring the view. Finally, he stopped the boat, and the view was simply amazing. The captain pointed out a pod of whales about a quarter of a mile away. They were cavorting about, diving and jumping. The captain was explaining their behaviors, but keeping his distance. It was pretty cool. All the whales suddenly dived and disappeared, emerging moments later right next to our boat. They were swimming all around us, diving and jumping and splashing us with water. Children were laughing. Everyone thought it was part of the show. They were right there, almost so close that you could touch them. The captain told us how lucky we were to see them up close. Suddenly, the mood changed when they started bumping up against the hull of the small boat. People were sliding all over the place. Some fell onto the floor. Children were crying. Most telling, the captain had stopped narrating and had a look of abject terror on his face. I remember thinking what it must take to make this guy scared. And as he looked terrified, we probably should be too. Suddenly, as quickly as they appeared, the whales disappeared. They were just gone. People picked themselves up and sat back down. Mothers consoled children. We started back to the dock. The captain got back on the PA and tried to downplay the seriousness of what just happened, but there was a definite quiver in his voice as we headed back to shore. Story 9. A few things come to mind, but I have to say, deadheads. In my younger days, I was captain of a dragger out of Kodiak, Alaska. She was a 130-foot Giddings marine trawler. I'll never forget my first week in the wheelhouse with the owner who was retiring and showing me the operation before I took over. After a night busting ice off the rails and freezing rain in 2-meter seas, he went to bunk and left me to wheel watch. It was clearing up with medium haze and flat, calm waters. Most of the crew was sleeping or hanging out in the galley, so I was alone and the only eyes forward. I'm drinking some nasty Folgers and sucking down a Marlboro Red when I see what looked like an old pier piling straight ahead. I kept looking at that spot and nope, nothing there. A few seconds later, I swear I saw that thing again, but only closer. Nope, gone again. I thought, crap, I've been up way too long and I'm effing hallucinating. Then, out of nowhere, this tree trunk shoots directly up into the sky. This thing had to be 60 feet tall and was about 30 feet off the bow, dead center. I damn near crapped myself. I pushed to port and rubbed the tree with the right side of the bow. We were at a good 14-knot clip, which is fast as hell for an almost fully loaded trawler. Then it shot down and disappeared about midship. I later learned that these are pretty uncommon in the Aleutians, where we were fishing. They're called deadheads, and only 2 of the guys on the boat had seen them before. They float vertically and bob straight up and down. These things were known to destroy older wood boats and kill crews. I'm just glad I wasn't dragging the net, and it would have cost us in the ballpark of $100K. I've seen what most people would consider worse, but the fear that a huge bobbing tree in the middle of the Alaskan waters comes out of effing nowhere tops my list. Story 10. I sailed on the American aircraft carrier USS George Washington in 2000 and 2002. A couple things I remember are pulling into Lisbon, Portugal for a port visit. Carriers can't pull pier side in Lisbon, so we had to take boats back and forth. I was looking down at the water, and there wasn't a square inch that didn't have a jellyfish in it. We were sailing through a giant bloom of them, and all I could think of is if someone could survive if they fell in. The USS Cole was part of our battle group. We left her behind in the Red Sea while we went through the Suez Canal. Once we entered the Mediterranean Sea, the Admiral went on the 1MC, ship speaker system, and told us that a rib boat had hit her and blown a hole in the side. About a month later, we were pulling into Palma, Spain, when a rib boat came barreling towards us. The security detail was called on deck, and we were ready to blow them out of the water. The commanding officer quickly told them to not shoot. It turned out to be a Greenpeace. For the next 5 hours, Greenpeace and hundreds of their friends circled the ship in their boats and jet skis. Those guys probably had no idea how close they came to getting killed that day. Sailing across the Atlantic, especially in the winter, can get intense. Carriers have advanced stabilization capabilities because the flight deck needs to be safe for landing. Even with that, there are times where the ship bobbed around like a cork. Story 11. Nothing too extensive like some of the stories here, but I worked as a tuna fisherman for a tiny bit, where I'd spend 3 to 4 weeks out at a time, taking around 3 days of 24-hour travel to get where we, me and one other person, the captain, who was a fifth-generation fisherman, were fishing. So many stories of insane things that I could be here all night. But one was near the end of the season, and we pushed out farther than we should have, over 100 nautical miles, where we had no business being as a 37-foot trawler, and then were caught in a bad storm. I had barely enough time to very carefully board up all the windows before the boat started scooping when coming down one of the 12-foot waves. The first third of the boat dives underwater before popping back up, only to travel up another wave and do it again and again, as waves got larger and things got worse. Basically, the captain and I stayed in the cabin, bracing ourselves with each wave, staring at the radar in hopes we could stay in the position of taking waves head on and avoid being capsized. After a few minutes, and the fear that this fifth-generation fisherman was exuding, I just accepted that I was going to die there. And the experience of that acceptance and the event itself had a profound effect on my perception and the way I've lived life afterward. We eventually made it out and didn't say a lot to each other afterward. Lots of stories from that time, but this was the creepiest, I'd say. Yeah, so stories like this, when there are people out there that adamantly refuse to go on a boat, go in the water, and you kind of understand the PTSD when you read stories like this. Story 12. I was on a 2-week cruise on a huge ship, and one morning there was a ton of commotion coming from one side of the ship. It looked like a woman had fallen off the ship and was in the water below, face down in a summer dress, her hair sprawling around her as she lay face down and completely motionless in the water, bobbing up and down as she was carried by gentle waves of the ocean. You think you're tough until you see some crap like that. People were crying, taking their curious kids elsewhere. Others were frantically trying to find staff to go rescue her. As it turns out, a woman had left her sundress and wig out to dry on her balcony the night before, and the wind that morning had blown it into the water. An announcement was made, and everyone was so relieved, and there was a lot of laughter. It was surreal to see everyone going from such worried, sad expressions, some were outright bawling their eyes out, to completely in hysterics, laughing and hugging one another. I think we were all reminded of how precious life was that day. It really was a huge relief. It was terrible in the moments where we thought it was an actual person. What made it believable is that you're up so high on this ship, it's hard to see details down below because of the distance along with the waves and water obscuring finer details. My friends and I, who were on the cruise together, drank and laughed a lot that night. It was a very sobering event. Story 13. I'm not a sailor at all, but I did a few boat trips with a friend who moved boats around for a living. He was usually carrying boats from the French Riviera, Monaco, Nice, Antibes, Cannes, to Corsica. My very first trip with him, we left from Monaco on our way to, I think, Calvi. We left in the evening, and the trip started very well, with the dolphins following us around. Nice moment. Around 2 a.m., in the middle of a pitch-black night, very far from any coast, we saw a tiny light in the distance, pretty much on our way. As we got closer, we saw it was a tiny fishing boat, the kind that usually doesn't go very far from the coast, except we were more than 100 kilometers from the coast. We slowed down as we got close to it and yelled to check if someone was on it. No answer, so we decided to get close to it, and soon it became obvious it was empty. There were just a few bottles of water, some snacks, some fishing gear, and even some dead fish in a bucket, and an old Nokia phone, still on, but nobody on. My friend called on the radio, explaining the situation. Italian Coast Guards told us to wait around till they arrived. We did, and when they arrived, they told us they would investigate the situation. They took our ID, wrote down our explanation of the situation, and let us leave to finish our trip. The whole thing was creepy to me, as it seemed obvious the owner had fallen from the boat, couldn't get back in, and drowned. I had this in mind for weeks, thinking we could maybe have rescued the guy if we had passed there slightly earlier. After a while, this story faded in my mind, and I went on with my life. Till someday, my friend called me to explain that he got a call from an Italian guy who thanked him because he could get his boat back thanks to us. He was the owner of the tiny boat, who explained he was out fishing not too far from the shore when he had a big chest pain. He made an emergency call and was soon rescued, but his boat was left adrift, till we found it. Learning that the guy was still alive erased the creepy side of this story from my head, and I was happy about it. Story 14. Years ago, my friends and I visited Thailand and went on several excursions on a boat with a captain. One of the evenings, we were out at night and it was pitch black except for the green lights that were coming from the large commercial fishing boats way out in the distance. We had stopped for a while to take in the view and eat when it started to rain. The captain thought it was best to head back and then quickly realized that the boat propeller wasn't working and something was caught on it. He grabbed his head-mounted flashlight and a knife and jumped in the water. He was gone for a good minute, which felt like eternity as we were huddled around trying to figure out what was happening. Fear started kicking in as we waited. Then he suddenly re-emerged, panting, and told us that shortly after he jumped in, he lost his flashlight and had to literally feel his way underwater towards the propeller, reaching and cutting a plastic tarp that had wound itself around the propeller, cut it loose, and made his way back to the surface in the dark. It was a strange set of emotions as we were completely impressed with the badass display we just witnessed, relieved he made it back, but also freaked out imagining what would have happened if he hadn't. Story 15. I didn't witness what happened. I witnessed the guy it happened to. Early 2000s, and a man I know who looks like a biker who should be a pro wrestler is working as a union underwater welder. He's working a contract in the St. Louis Bridge across the Mississippi River. He would usually stop by after work and eat some food or have a beer, as I was on his way home. We'd known each other a long time. I've never even remotely seen him scared or afraid. One day he shows up in the middle of the day, hours before he would normally be off work, and he looks terrified. I thought maybe he got robbed or held at gunpoint or something along those lines. He tells me he's underwater welding like every other day, and he starts to get a bad feeling. He says you can't really see anything down there on a good day, and that day was worse than normal. He stops working, and he's trying to see whatever it is he can see that's giving him the feeling. He said he got a feeling in his stomach like it's already too late, and he turns his head and looks behind him, and he can see something sparkly and shiny a foot or so away. He reaches out to try and touch it and realizes it's its own reflection because he can see his hand reaching towards him. Said it took a second to realize it, but he was looking into an eyeball as big as he is, dark black and reflecting him in it. He bolts to the surface and gets out the water, quits on the spot, and comes and stops at my house and tells me the story. I've known him for years. He's not the type that makes things up or even really has a sense of humor. He's easily 6'4". I believe he went through exactly what he said he did that day, and that story and the way he looked have sat with me since. I assume he came across some granddaddy of a catfish down there, but I don't know. A 6-foot eyeball? Story 16. Not a job, but I've been scuba diving in the dark before. There was a moment where I strayed a little too far from the lights and lost where the surface was. The dimly lit void all around me, nothing but tiny bubbles and particles drifting through beams of my little torch. It almost felt as if I was asleep, or like nothing existed but me and nothingness. There is a definite dreamlike quality to the experience, probably because I was floating. It was beautiful, of course. I imagined it was a little like being in space, but also the terror of being somewhere you did not belong. A medium that your body was not made to exist in is a very sharp feeling. The realization that if I kept swimming in the wrong direction, my life could actually be in danger probably wouldn't have occurred to me if I hadn't been trained on what to do in this exact scenario. It's pretty easy to panic in that position. I eventually managed to orient myself with the bubbles from my mask, and it turned out that I wasn't that far from the surface, lol. When I got back up, I realized I was a lot further from the boat than I thought, though. Swam the whole way back less than a meter down. The time between me realizing I was lost to me reaching open air was probably less than a minute, but it felt like eternity. I think anyone who's been in the ocean at night would agree. It's a different world out there. Story 17. I so rarely get to tell the story of Oscar. It's one of my favorites, and all true. I was working as a dive instructor on a tiny island in the Gulf of Thailand. Long time ago. We had a lot of backpackers who stuck around to train as recreational dive masters. One guy who was part of a group of friends training us was a Swede named Oscar. I liked him. Sweet kid, very nice, highly athletic, and fun to be around. Good to work with. Very short and good looking with long blonde hair. A tiny little Viking friend. When dive masters finish the program, we usually have a party with lots of silly games, stupid rites of passage, including drinking a bucket of Thai whiskey and Red Bull through a snorkel, etc. Just a stupid reason for really excessive drinking. We had several of these per month. In the middle of Oscar's party and feats of ceremonial consumption, he had to leave with a friend to catch an overnight ferry across the Gulf for a dive trip. No problem, he made the ferry. But his friend woke up a little before daybreak and couldn't find him anywhere on the boat. Anywhere. Oscar had disappeared at some point during the 7-hour night trip. No one saw him fall, but apparently he had. Around the same time, back home on our tiny island, Oscar's roommate was confused to find him dripping wet at the door, but with a rather lengthy explanation. Alcohol, Xanax, and weed sent Oscar above deck for a cigarette in the middle of the night. He didn't remember falling, but he remembered seeing the boat leave him struggling, treading in the cold, 4 to 6 foot November surge in the Gulf of Thailand, alone. Soon, there was no light in the distance at all. None. Not even in the moonless, clouded sky. No light in any direction on the water. No indication of which way led to shore, possibly 100 kilometers away, and which way led to sea. No idea which way the current was taking him. Alone, comprehending, then panicking, swimming, struggling to think, struggling to stay afloat, trying to think through the alcohol and drugs, through the cold and the fear, the constant rise and fall and beating of the water, the aching, heavy limbs and burning lungs aspirating salt water for hours. He didn't know how many. Enough time to understand thoroughly that he was going to die. Any minute. Maybe this one. No salvation. No hope of rescue. Time to say goodbyes and prayers. He would die cold, suffering, alone, and he would never be found. Then, exhausted and numb, there was another pain. The sudden, disorienting pain of being thrown against a solid object. Though he could not see it. He had touched nothing solid in hours. His body had forgotten as it was dying. It was terrifying. It was a tiny fishing boat, possibly the only one within countless square miles of remote water. The handful of crew was asleep for the night on deck, thank God, or they likely wouldn't have heard him calling for help. He rowed home in silence. Burmese boat boys don't tend to speak English. That's the story as he told it while he was gathering fresh clothes. There was only a few minutes to catch the morning ferry. He was going to catch up with his friend, who was by now on the mainland, across the Gulf, and he was going effing diving. Story 18. I've always found the dark of night eerie, with the jet black sky and the somehow darker ocean waving by. It completely removed your frame of reference. As a former miner who found the true darkness of the underground somewhat meditative when I occasionally turned off my headlamp, I weirdly never got used to the void of the dark ocean at night. However, the eeriest thing that happened is that over the series of 3 days, several black birds hit the side of the ship and then died in the crates below. I would reach into a crate for some piece of equipment and pull out a rigid little black body. The birds don't bleed. They seem to just die. I couldn't help but take it as a bad omen. However, nothing did happen, and birds are known to gravitate towards ships. One day during the same voyage, I reached out into a crate and felt the wriggle of a live body and pulled out a live, but shook up black little bird. We let it rest on the ship and gave it space until it was ready to take off. Even though I've seen some other objectively worse things in my career, for some reason, the birds just stick with me, and I find myself thinking about all those little birds often. Story 19. Used to sail a good portion of Alaskan waters in the Coast Guard, from Juneau up and out to the Bering Sea, mostly a lot of Gulf of Alaska stuff. After a while, watching green water come over, the bow isn't so scary, and some of the rough water is more inconvenient because you can't go out for a smoke without getting your cigarette wet. Some of the more eerie times would be when the fog rolls in and the water is still. It's a very surreal experience, and other than having the vessel for reference, visually, it's hard to determine your orientation. Other times would be out at sea with nothing for miles with cloud cover, so not even the stars were shining. If you were to walk the weather decks at night with the conditions just right, you would be instantly swallowed by the ink of the night as soon as you exit the hatch. Having served in the Coast Guard, we did a bit of just about everything you could imagine. Sub-escorts, body recovery, search and rescue, fisheries patrol, coast guarding, etc. The only time that I was ever genuinely scared was steaming towards a Maknak island from the Bering Sea during a winter storm. Waves were big enough to where you'd hear the screws, propellers for you landlubbers, coming out of the water occasionally. We took one wave beam too, and I watched and held on as our clinometer got dangerously close to 60 degrees. Our ship was rated to take 65 degrees. I don't think my a-hole has ever puckered tighter in my life. Had nightmares about it for a couple weeks. All in all, I miss being out at sea. Perhaps one day I'll find my way back. Story 20. Former Navy here. On my very first deployment out of Japan, my ship ended up in the doldrums. On Sundays, the command would try to do holiday routine, making allowances for people to sleep in a bit, minimizing extra activities, religious services, that kind of stuff. My watch schedule had me getting off watch around 6 a.m., so instead of sleeping in, I'd go out to the smoke deck/flight deck and just stand there as the sun rose. On this particular day, we'd entered a massive fog bank in the doldrums where the trade winds meet, and there's pretty much no wind. The ship had also come to a standstill in the night. When I went outside for my normal Sunday morning activities, I found I couldn't even see the edge of the boat due to the fog. I made my way over to the side, and as the sun started creeping up, visibility got just good enough where I could see 1 to 2 feet past the edge of the boat, but then just perfect gray. The water below us was completely undisturbed and reflecting the gray sky. So for about 15 minutes, I stood in a couple of feet of visibility. Then the bagpipes started. A little utilized policy at the time was that people could check in musical instruments to the command's morale locker and get it on Sundays to play. Some ensign had checked in bagpipes and in this eerie slate gray morning began playing a dirge from the bridge wings, but the fog was messing with acoustics, so the sound seemed to come from the water itself. The ambiance was perfect, early 2000s horror movie, so I went back inside, scrounged a waffle from the mess deck, and opted for a nap. Story 21. Avid sailor and adventurer hound here. I was sailing my small 30-foot sailboat from the San Francisco Bay Area to Vancouver, Canada with a couple of my buddies, one of my first coastal adventures north. We had run out of propane for a little gimbaled one-burner stove, which is what we were cooking with, and we pulled into a small bay in coastal Oregon to see if we could get a couple of small propane bottles it used. I anchored a bit offshore as there is a bunch of kelp, but some clear area, inflated the tender, and my 2 crew went ashore to reconnoiter and hopefully get some gas while I kept an anchor watch. After a time, I saw them cast off from shore and head to the boat in the inflatable, which was powered by 2 small horse outboard. As they got closer, a huge humpback whale spouted and then breached not a meter behind the boat. It dwarfed them, and my eyes got so big, and that, coupled with the look on my face, sent them scurrying as fast as they could to get to the boat. They were both shaking when they got back, but it was awesome in retrospect for all of us. Alright, so let's be honest here. If that whale really wanted to do harm to those 2 guys, it absolutely would have. So, glad you got out of there okay and can reflect upon that now in awe and admiration. Story 22. Years ago, as a young third mate, I was standing watch in the middle of the night during a trans-Pacific crossing. This particular night, there were no other ships in the area. No stars, no moon, just that extreme brand of darkness you can only find in the middle of the ocean with zero light pollution. About halfway through the watch, we started to hear this deep, low-frequency humming noise that we couldn't identify. After looking around the wheelhouse for the source, I stepped out onto the bridge wing to see if it was coming from outside. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. It was so dark, but the sound was definitely louder outside. I saw a faint light out of the corner of my eye, and I looked up at the mast where the antennas and radar were mounted, and was surprised to find the whole thing was shrouded in a glowing blue haze. I'm sure I'm not the only person in this thread who's encountered the meteorological phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire at sea, but I'll certainly never forget that eerie blue glow and deep hum on that dark night in the middle of the Pacific. Story 23. It wasn't in the ocean, and it wasn't creepy, but it's still a cool story, so I'll tell anyway. A couple of years back, I was having a rough night. I was on vacation, I think, and I went for a walk on the beach, at night, to clear my head. I walked along the shore next to the highest point that the water would reach. As I'm walking, I see a weird track mark coming up from the water. It looked like one big tire wheeled out of the ocean up the shore. I decided to follow it and went all the way up to where the grass meets the sand. The tall, grassy bushes were rustling like crazy, and the closer I got, the easier it was to hear the noises and see what it was. It was a huge, beautiful green sea turtle laying her eggs. I immediately got chills and waited for her to finish up and head back to sea. There was a big line of seaweed along the whole beach, and to help her easier get back to the water, I moved it out of the way and walked all the way down to the water with her. I even got to pet her. I named her Maggie, after my friend's dog who had recently passed away. She had just the same gentle giant energy, and she looked like a Maggie. I wish I was able to get a pic or video, but as soon as I went to take out my phone, it died. But that made the moment feel more special to me, like it was my own. Maggie was what I needed to see that night. Thank you, Maggie. I hope you and your babies are all thriving out there. Story 25. When I was in the Navy, our ship was used for torpedo practice by a submarine during war exercise. Since the entire area was closed off and monitored during the exercise, we could completely turn off all our lights, including signals and lanterns, while still running. It's completely pitch black in the middle of the night in the middle of the Baltic Sea, so dark the Milky Way was being reflected in the water. A practice torpedo runs a little deeper than usual so as not to accidentally hit anything, though modern torpedoes also explode below a ship's keel to use a bubble effect, and it has a very powerful floodlight so you can easily follow its path for evaluation. A bright light under the water in the Baltic Sea gives off a green, hazy light. So, from our point of view, in the pitch black looking at the Milky Way, and just hearing our engine in the waves, we would all of a sudden see this huge green light appear under the water, make a series of turns, and then head directly for us at like 50 knots. As it gets closer, you hear a whining noise from the blades, and it goes straight under your ship. And then it does it over and over again to finally just disappear. Logically, you know it's basically just a remote-controlled little submarine with a flashlight, but actually seeing it play out was creepy and cool as hell. Also, the fact there's a whole submarine out there just watching and shadowing you. Brr. Story 26. Without a doubt, the scariest was a effing massive container ship suddenly emerging in the dense fog and nearly running over our 5-person fishing boat in the middle of the night, with no warning other than it was on our radar. Veteran skipper was literally pacing in circles after it happened. Have no idea how it got that close, but apparently the ship wasn't communicating on the radio. Would have been over for us in seconds. Creepiest was a nickname written by finger and cigarette soot on the bunkroom ceiling. The guy had died an awful death at sea several years before, but in the years since, nobody had wiped away where he'd written his nickname. Most awe-inspiring were the storms. 40-foot seas were the biggest storm I ever saw, although there was one wave when I was sleeping that nearly slid me out of my bunk lengthwise, i.e. stood our boat up at a huge angle for a couple terrifying seconds, and I never got the height of that wave, but wouldn't be surprised if it was 50 to 60 feet based on the size of the boat. Coolest was a Bob Dylan CD still in its wrapper we pulled up in the catch. Blonde on Blonde. Slapped it in the CD player and it played. Story 27. I once asked my Pacific Islander platoon sergeant what was the scariest situation he was ever in, expecting a war story. When he was a teenager, he would go spear fishing while swimming. He would swim out with a spear and a little light that would attract fish, and spear fish as they swam up. He kept the fish he'd speared attached to a line that he tied to his pants. Had to be done during the dark so the fish would see the light. One time, a shark was trying to eat the fish on his line. He tried to fend off the shark for a while, but the shark was persistent, so he cut his losses and cut the line connecting him to his fish. He had been dealing with the shark for so long, he wasn't paying attention to where he was drifting. When he looked up, he didn't see his island. He didn't see boats. He didn't see anything. Just an empty horizon. He panicked and thought for sure he would die. Only thing he could think to do was to expend as little energy as possible and just float as best as he could. Eventually, he did drift to where he could see the lights of his island and was able to swim ashore. Been a few years since I heard the story. I can't remember how long he drifted for. Story 28. I'm sure there will be more than a few people who will believe this story, and if you don't, I hope you enjoy it, but I do swear it's true. Didn't happen out at sea, but along the inside passage of SE, Alaska. I spent a summer in SE, Alaska working at a fish cannery, camping a couple miles away near a small town on a gear lot that belonged to one of the fishing boat captains. During the week, I'd get a ride to and from work, but on the weekends, I was sometimes on my own. Since I didn't have a car, I would walk a couple miles into town to shop for food. It was a quiet paved road following the beach of the inside passage. The road was a cut bank, a long right-hand sweep, rocky beach and ocean on one side, steep tree-covered mountainside on the other. It provided an open view of the entire route from my camp into town. The road continued a couple miles past the gear lot I was camping out at to a few houses further outside town. The road may have connected up with another or dead-ended, but there was never much traffic and certainly no one on foot, except me. There were bears and moose in the area, but that time of year, typically they weren't in the area. You might see signs now and then, but it was pretty rare. The native people of the area, the Tlingit, tell about the Kushtaka depending on how you say it, or Otterman in English. Otterman is a shapeshifter and a trickster, an otter-like creature that can lure people into the water, or sometimes into the wilderness, tricking them to their deaths. The elders would tell stories of people who had drowned after they had gone down to the river, or by the ocean, by themselves. So you shouldn't go near a body of water by yourself. If you hear a voice calling to you or see someone in the water waving to you, beware, it could be the Otterman. And you certainly never say the name or talk about the Kushtaka when you're around water. I'm a very experienced outdoors person. Very bear, big cat, and moose conscious. Never afraid of the outdoors, just respectful. I'm also not superstitious, but I do understand that there are things out there that I must respect and be wary of, whether it be wild animals, weather, or some other natural phenomena. I had more than a couple strange things happen walking that road. I would frequently catch a heavy scent of honeysuckle, even though there were no vines or other flowering plants about. Sometimes it might sound like there was something in the water, but there were dolphins that would come and go in the night. I could hear them breathing sometimes, but one evening was different. Walking back from dinner with friends, I was making my way carefully and quietly along the road back to camp. As I mentioned, I could see the whole stretch of road as it wound along the bay. As usual, I didn't want to run into an animal, so I was keeping a close eye on the road ahead. But somewhere along the way, a young woman suddenly appeared, walking the opposite direction. I was dumbstruck and surprised as I hadn't had any indication I was coming up to someone. As we got close, she smiled, and as our eyes met, she blushed and quickly looked away. I was stunned and unable to utter a word, and I felt a little embarrassed too. I continued walking, still disbelieving someone appearing out of nowhere. And such a strikingly beautiful woman. Out here? I was new in town, but I certainly would have noticed her. Where the hell did she come from? I think I whispered. Curious, I looked over my shoulder to catch another glance of her, and no one was there. So, OP didn't say it, but I think we're all thinking it. Maybe either a hallucination or a little encounter with the supernatural. I don't know. Creepy story. Story 29. Not so much at sea, but I was on a tiny island in the middle of a huge lake, big enough that you could only just barely see the shadow of the shore, for a month to do some mapping, so hopefully it still counts. The island was small, just a small patch of trees holding some dirt together hanging onto the rock. We got dropped off on a float plane with tents, a small motorboat, food, and tools. The most unsettling thing was the fog and silence that lasted through every morning. It was thick enough that you couldn't see 20 feet in front of you, and it dampened all the sound. It was like the island was stuck in a bubble of nothingness. You forgot that the world outside existed. Even the water was still as a mirror, adding to the effect. It just felt so open and endless. Eventually, it got to be too much for the crew answer, ended up using the chainsaw on the main shore in our free time, and carrying over loads of wood to make rough fence that walled in the area around our tents, fire, and office tent. Just having the walls to block out the emptiness made it so much better. Story 30. As I was holding the night watch on our sailboat, alone with the vastness of the Indian Ocean, the sea turned into a mirror. We were going at a gentle pace of 5 knots. All around, endless miles of ocean. The nearest land is 1,000 miles away. Entranced by the stars, I only glanced away for a moment to check the fathometer, which had been consistently reading a depth of 12,000 feet. But in that minute of stargazing, the world beneath us had transformed. The fathometer now flashed a startling 30 feet. My heart skipped a beat. The possibility of running aground in the middle of an ocean seemed impossible, yet terrifyingly real. Turned out to be one of the ocean's hidden plateaus, a vast underwater shelf. It was a stark reminder of the ocean's mysteries, hidden just beneath the surface, invisible to our eyes, yet nearly within reach. A humbling moment that underscored the insane depths that lay just beneath our keel. I do have mild thalassophobia, fear of deep/vast bodies of water, which doesn't help. Story 31. Not really the sea, but I was voluntold to be in a sailing program during my sophomore summer at my college. It was basically 2 weeks of training and then 3 to 4 days out and back on a trip to a New England destination. Ours was Mystic, Connecticut, but that's not important. Our practice area was a few miles off the Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse in the northern Chesapeake, just off the coast of Annapolis. While practicing how to avoid accidental jibing, when the wind passes the stern and the sail's boom swings across the cockpit, which can be extremely dangerous, we heard a pan-pan, sorta like Mayday but not as serious, call over the Coast Guard channel about a sailboat that someone fell out of without a life jacket near the Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse. We left our sails and motored over there at a measly 5 to 7 kts and went back and forth in the area trying to find signs of life until the sun grew too low to meaningfully search. All we found were 2 sandals and a boonie/fishing hat floating like 20 yards apart. 2 days later, they found the washed-up, bloated corpse of a 22-year-old. It freaked me out because I was 22 at the time. We probably went right over him. The trip to Mystic was pretty awesome, but tiring. Story 32. Was with a group on the east coast of Africa and hired a boat. A really primitive thing, like a large canoe with a stabilizer off one side. At the time, I recall us, about 15 people, questioning the people renting them out whether it was seaworthy and big enough for us, but they insisted it was absolutely fine. It's hard to say how far out we were, but certainly farther than that one guy who swims the furthest out, and probably the same again. We started taking on water, and in response, we used anything we had to hand to bail it back out. No matter how hard we tried, we were no match for the sea. The boat sat lower and lower, and people began to panic. That moment arrived where we've not sank, but there's an inevitability. A tipping point and realization we're going down and there's nothing we can do. It's all rather gentle at first, as the weight of the water on board slowly draws the boat down. Then, whoosh! The water breaks past the top of the boat, and within a matter of seconds, the entire vessel is sucked under with significant pressure. People are screaming, grabbing hold of one another. Others jump, bags and bottles float to the surface, till eventually there's no evidence of a boat ever having been there. 15 people of varying confidence at swimming, with an unknown depth below us, and the best part of a kilometer from land. Okay, so what happened afterwards? How could you possibly tell a story like that and leave us hanging with a cliffhanger such as that? Come on! Story 33. I was part of a biological survey team on Andros Island in the Bahamas one summer when I was a very young man. I was one of the few qualified scuba divers in our camp, and everyone would dive in pairs. I got called one evening to accompany the camp dive master to recover a piece of equipment. I don't recall exactly what, that was lost that day. This was several decades ago, and Andros was very rural. Accordingly, losing even simple tools and equipment was a big deal. Also, the day is long on Andros in the summer, so by that time, most other divers had been off duty for hours, and had already partaken of one or more of the local recreational substances, so were out. This was supposed to be a quick out, dive, and back. Now, this was before GPS was a common civilian navigational tool, and by the time the boat got us out to where the equipment was supposed to have been lost, we were already losing light. We dove and looked around a bit. After a while, it was the dive master that signaled to me with him. He pointed out that it was getting dark, so we needed to head back. When we got back, for some reason, the skipper was freaking out and told us to get our asses on board. We did, and he hightailed it out with the lights off. It was a freakish weird trip in the dark with only starlight in the engines, but it only got weirder when I realized ours was not the only engine I could hear, and the other boat or boats were not running any lights either. The dive master explained to me that the waters at night were a hotbed for smugglers, and we did not want to run into any of them since they were very dangerous men. We were almost back to camp when the skipper put the lights on. It was easily the most Miami Vice crap I'd ever done, and even though we recovered no equipment, we still got crap-faced drunk once we got back. Story 34. Years back, when I worked on a trawler in the North Sea, we had an experience that stuck with me. It was in late October. The sea was rougher, colder. We were in a profitable area, far from the usual routes, when the sonar started showing a strange, jagged outline on the bottom, nothing we'd ever seen before, and it was huge. The day had been gray, the sea choppy, but suddenly a fog descended. It was so thick and fast it felt unnatural. The equipment started acting up, losing power intermittently, and the GPS couldn't keep a fix. Out of nowhere, the boat shuddered. We all felt it. Something had caught the net. Thinking we snagged on a submerged object, we scrambled to retrieve it. The net came up in tatters, like it had been through a shredder. We didn't hang around to investigate. The decision was unspoken but unanimous. Once we were a safe distance away, the fog cleared as abruptly as it had appeared, and our equipment buzzed back to life. We didn't talk much about it afterward. The sea's full of unexplained phenomena, and you learn to live with it. But that day was different. It was the only time I ever saw the captain look over his shoulder as we sailed to safer waters. Story 35. Worked on a schooner in California years ago. Me and the bosun were shaking out the crew for morning chores, scrubbing the deck and polishing brass. A new deckhand was scheduled to join. She was from Maine, so we'd hoped she had some experience. Sitting at the end of the dock, however, was a girl in a lavender vinyl pantsuit, LL Bean duck boots, and the cutest little suitcase. She had just graduated college with an art degree. After a 2-week sailing excursion in Camden, she decided to try her hand at sailing. Calling around to various boats, our office was the first to take her in. Lucky us. She was bright enough, but a maritime education, starting from scratch, on a wooden sailing ship. Let me tell you, we got our steps in. Slowly but surely, she learned the ropes. Off came the shores, and less working aloft. Away went the heavy garments that just soak up water, in favor of a t-shirt and light khaki pants. Gloves gave way to calloused hands, and throw that godforsaken Swiss Army knife over the side. One day, she was splicing ratlines, and it hit me. I looked around for the bosun. His eyes twinkled, and he tried not to smile. It was time. We knocked everyone off early and ran some much-needed errands. After dinner, we gathered on the forecastle, where the crew bunked. In the gloom of the musty compartment, the ceremony began. We passed around a bottle of rum and shared it with all but her. Each crew member read a selected passage or poem. The bosun's contribution was a personalized version of The Ice Worm by Robert Service. He recited it from memory, slowly and deliberately. As he read the final lines, we presented the bottle of rum to her. Mourning her former life, she let go a few tears and took a big slug from the bottle. Then the bosun handed her a new rigging knife, straight-bladed with a thick back to accept hammer blows, for that stubborn line or wire. We were a tight bunch, and passengers would comment how well we got along, how effortless we made it look. Our last trip of the season was a week-long transit from Long Beach to Monterey, beating up the whole way. Some maintenance before the summer season started, then change out with another crew. Anchored in Catalina, we made plans to travel together. What about our newest shipmate? She had a boyfriend back home, but she was pretty sure that was over. He wasn't a sailor, but how to break it to him? Leave that to me. I picked a postcard at the store in Two Harbors. I wrote she had found a new love, and that love is the sea. And once the sea has a hold of your soul, you can never get free. Not knowing the boyfriend's name, I simply stamped it and gave it to her. She read it, gave me a hug, and then posted it before we sailed. The trip north wasn't particularly rough. 15-foot swells from the northwest, typical for Point Conception, but we lost the bobstay and a backstay. So the captain decided to run back to Long Beach for repairs. It was an easy point of sail, but it put the waves on our port quarter. I had the 4 to 8 watch, traditional for the chief mate. I came into the cockpit at 15:50 to relieve the bosun. Both watches, almost a dozen people, were scattered about the deck for turnover. A shadow loomed over my left shoulder, and a huge wave swept half the deck, rolling the ship to starboard and dragging crew and passengers with it. Quick hands got a hold of the passengers, halting their departure, but the curly locks of our mainer went over the side and started drifting astern. The dreaded call of man overboard went up as life rings and life jackets were tossed over the side. I stayed with the ship in Long Beach while the rest of the crew flew to Maine for the service. The bosun returned and described the scene. The family had been understanding of what had happened. While they weren't sailors, life in coastal Maine gave them a healthy respect for the sea. But the bosun was still uneasy. "What is it?" I asked. "I met the boyfriend," he said. He was pretty shaken. Shortly after getting the news of the accident, he received a postcard. Story 36. This is going to remain buried, but I have yet to find an explanation of it. This was in 2007. I can't remember the exact time of the year, but I want to say it was summer. It was on a 378, the USCGC Dallas, about 300 nautical miles off the coast of Massachusetts. Zero light pollution. I was standing flywatch. Flywatch is located on top of the bridge, exposed to the outside. There are these giant binoculars we called the Big Eyes mounted in the center of the platform. We could report any contacts down to the bridge through a sounding tube to just make them aware in case the contact was too small for the radar to pick up. Anyways, it was about 0100, not a cloud in the sky, zero light pollution besides from the moon, and super calm waters. I had a break-in, someone learning how to stay on the watch with me. There were 2 things off that night before this absolutely insane event happened. First, there was a star in the sky that was casting a light reflection in the water similar to the moon. The strange thing was that it wasn't the brightest star in the sky. Not too strange, but I had never seen something like that before. Second, we lost power about 5 minutes after I noticed that star. This wasn't too uncommon because these boats were pretty old, so I just reported the power outage. Now comes the insane part. About 5 minutes after lost power, it was as if someone flicked a light switch to turn on the daylight. Sudden daylight with blue skies. It lasted for about 3 seconds, then sudden darkness again. I know what lightning looks like at night because I had been on this boat for about 1.5 years and had seen countless lightning storms. You see a source of light, it flickers and flashes. This was a complete illumination of the sky with blue skies. I was freaking out and completely disregarded protocol for reporting things to the bridge and said, "Did you guys just see that?" And I heard them joking around about it in the bridge, and one person say, "We're being attacked by aliens," and heard laughter from them. I asked my break-in what he saw, and he said the exact same thing I did, blue skies and all. When we were relieved from watch, I went to the bridge and asked what they thought it was, and nobody had any idea, and they just shrugged it off like it wasn't the insane thing that it was. My mind has been blown ever since, and I've yet to find an explanation. Story 37. On watch at sunrise on a glassy sea, I saw on the horizon an object raised above the surface. It was huge, a bulge on the water at a great distance. In order to be visible to me, it would have had to have been hundreds of meters long, much larger than any vessel. I thought I must be hallucinating, but no, others saw it too. To make matters more interesting, eventually I realized that it was moving. I traversed a large distance without getting closer. This took up about 30 minutes, during which my curiosity raged in incomprehension. I turned over every possibility but could not come up with a single rational explanation for what I was witnessing. The low light and gentle sea made it all the more eerie, because in every other way, it was an unalarming, even relaxing environment. Whatever it was eventually moved towards us, and we ran right into it, at which point I discovered what it was and all of my questions were answered. When I tell you, it'll make sense. But until then, my mind was at an absolute fever pitch, as if I saw God descend from the sky. I had never before been confronted with such an inexplicable situation. Another completely different story, scuba diving at night. It's common for large predators like barracuda to trail you, staying just outside your circle of light. They stay behind you, which shows that they're aware of how you work. They know you have eyes in front and can't see behind you. I've never heard of a cuda attacking a human, but just knowing that they understand your vulnerabilities and automatically exploit them is profoundly disturbing. I've experienced the same thing with wolves in the Arctic. Anyway, you have to be careful about where you point your diving light, because if you spotlight a vulnerable fish, a huge barracuda, 3 to 4 feet long, can come shooting over your shoulder and eat the poor thing before you know what happened. It's disconcerting, to say the least, to have this big creature, which you didn't know was there, inches from your body at incredible speed. You know that if it chose to attack you, you couldn't do a thing about it. Story 39. I went on my honeymoon to Bora Bora. I'm terrified of water, and even snorkeling in clear water scares the crap out of me. My husband convinced me to go, and I figured I came all this way. I can't let my fear stand in the way. First stop, the captain takes us out to the middle of the atoll where the water is black and tells us to jump out. I can hear my heart in my ears, and I'm second-guessing my life's choices. No sooner are we in the water, and the boat takes off without us. We had to swim to it in order to be able to go out on the rest of the snorkeling adventure, which they informed us when we were in the water. I'm no Michael Phelps, but I sure kicked it into high gear to get the F out of that water. While turbo doggy paddling like my life depended on it, I also was watching under me into the onyx abyss, convinced I was never going to see my family again because a giant sea creature was about to launch out of the deep and eat me. That's when it happened. Something about 10 plus meters below and the size of a bus swam under me. That's when I surely beat Michael Phelps records and got into the boat faster than humanly possible. The snorkeling guide also saw it, so I was not imagining this monster. I think it may have been a manta ray, but I'll never know for sure. Story 40. I'm Coast Guard, and once upon a time, a large group of Russian warships decided to do training off the coast of Hawaii. While they never crossed the line of being in U.S. waters, they were super close and essentially poking the U.S. and saying, "What are you going to do about it?" We had just gotten underway from Oahu, and were 2 days into steaming straight north heading to Alaska. We get a call from very high up in the chain of command. "Turn around, go back to Hawaii. We need you to monitor the Russian armada off of Hawaii." The Navy didn't have a single ship ready to get underway, so for 5 days, we followed the Russians around till a group of destroyers could get prepared and meet up with us. But for 5 days, we just watched the Russians. One morning around 3 a.m., I get woken up by this screeching noise. I'm a heavy sleeper, but this noise was like nothing I've ever heard, on a boat. It sounded like a bottle rocket. I was laying in my rack trying to figure out what the F it could be. I thought someone had gotten one of those prank noise machine things that run off button batteries and don't stop making noise till you smash it. I started timing it because it was so uniform and timely, like a metronome. Every 47 seconds it would screech off, fade, silence, repeat. I started looking all around, couldn't find anything. It wouldn't get louder or quieter. I lived on the 3 deck, completely under the waterline, so I went up 1 deck, 2nd deck, partially underwater, partially above. Could still hear it. Found my buddy also looking around for the noise. We were stumped, went back to bed, and the next morning everyone was talking about it. Some of the old salts who had lots of time in told us it was sonar pings. We were getting hit by sonar, likely from a Russian sub. It lasted for 3 days. Story 41. Not sure if this counts, but spooky nonetheless. This summer, I went on a research ship in northern Greenland where we had to make some DNA samples of fish around an old deserted mine, Black Angel Mine. During the evening, the whole crew decides to hop on land and take a walk around, and we went to this one abandoned house. The moment we step in, 2 of the crew members stopped and turned around, saying they felt an evil presence. The rest of us kept walking through the house, exploring old stuff left behind by previous people. We decided to pick up small pieces of Greenlandic marble as it was lying around everywhere, and taking it back to the ship. What started as an excited, happy vibe was replaced with a quiet, eerie vibe. It was only the 2 people that didn't step into the house that were superstitious. The rest of us didn't think much of it. The whole time we were there, we felt watched. Everyone, especially since one of us, had vicious nightmares that night, and none of us slept through and were hardly able to work throughout the day. Later the next day, we met an old fisherman from a nearby settlement, and we told him that we went to the old mine, and he asked us if we had seen Quivitok. Quivitok in Greenlandic mythology is someone who leaves society, from shame, exclusion of society, punishment, etc., and vanishes into nature, where they will learn supernatural powers and are feared when walking around in nature. We then decided to throw our small marble pieces overboard, superstitious or not. We were all so scared the Quivitok would come after us, lol.